I had my teeth halfway through a ham sandwich when every alarm on the bridge started screaming at the same time. The tactical display lit up with so many red contacts that the entire screen turned crimson, and my coffee mug slid across the console from the vibration of the alert horns. I dropped the sandwich, wiped my hands on my uniform, and pulled up the sensor feed with both hands already moving across the controls. My heart hammered once, hard, and then my training took over and turned the panic into focus. 412 warships. That was the number staring back at me from the screen. 412 vessels of the Draythari Galactic Empire, each one painted in that ridiculous gold and black color scheme they loved so much, arranged in a perfect intimidation sphere around our position near the outer colony of New Anchorage. They had dropped out of hyperspace all at once, which meant this was coordinated, planned, rehearsed down to the microsecond. They wanted us to see them arrive together, a single fist slamming down on the table to make every glass in the room rattle. I turned to report the contact count to Captain Lucia Dominguez, and that is when something happened that I will never forget for as long as I live. She was mid-sip on her coffee, reading the same sensor data on her own display, and she laughed so hard that coffee came out of her nose. Not a polite chuckle, not a surprised gasp. A full, chest-deep, tears-in-the-eyes burst of laughter that bent her forward in her command chair until her forehead nearly touched the armrest. The bridge went quiet for about 2 seconds. Then the communications officer, a woman named Claire Barton, who had been in the fleet longer than most of us had been alive, looked at her own screen, looked at the captain, and started laughing too. It spread like a virus, jumping from host to host. Danny Webb at navigation put his face in his hands, and his shoulders shook. Pete Gallagher at engineering snorted so loud it echoed off the bulkheads. Within 30 seconds, every officer on the bridge of the human flagship Junkyard Dog was laughing, and I was standing there with ham sandwich crumbs on my shirt, trying to figure out if I had missed something critically important. Then I looked at the tactical data again. Really looked at it. Not the number of ships, but the ships themselves, their weapon signatures, their shield frequencies, their engine output, and I understood. The Draythari Empire was old, not just old in the way that made historians excited, but old in the way that should have made their engineers deeply embarrassed. They had ruled the galaxy for 12,000 years, conquered over 6,000 species, and built an empire so vast that light itself got tired crossing it. Their diplomats had sent 3 separate ultimatums to humanity, demanding tribute, submission, and the surrender of our shipyards. We had ignored all 3. Not rejected, not countered with our own demands. Ignored. The way you ignore a message from someone trying to sell you something you did not ask for and do not need. And now High Marshal Kethanis, commander of the Draythari 9th Grand Armada, was broadcasting an open transmission on every frequency the galaxy used. I could hear his voice booming through the bridge speakers, translated into English by our systems, with a slight delay that made his dramatic pauses even more theatrical. He was speaking in that formal, grandiose way the Draythari loved, announcing to thousands of watching species across the galaxy that humanity would now be brought to heel, that the 9th Grand Armada, pride of the Imperial Fleet, the finest fighting force in 12,000 years of Draythari civilization, would demonstrate the consequences of defying the will of the autarch. It was quite a speech. He talked about the fire of empire and the weight of history and the futility of resistance. He referenced ancient victories and conquered worlds and species that had been ground to dust for daring to stand against the Golden Banner. His ships unfurled energy sails as he spoke, massive wings of crackling plasma that spread out from their hulls like the feathers of some enormous predatory bird preparing to dive. Weapon arrays powered up across the fleet, and I could see the heat signatures blooming across my screen as hundreds upon hundreds of gun ports opened along their polished golden hulls. It was theater, pure, practiced, 12,000-year-old theater, performed for an audience of billions across the galaxy, vassal species watching from their occupied worlds, where Draythari governors controlled every aspect of their lives, client states monitoring from their tribute stations, where they paid a percentage of everything they produced to the Imperial Treasury. Every corner of the Draythari Empire was tuned in to watch the mighty Armada humble another upstart species that had dared to say no. And we were laughing at them. Captain Dominguez wiped her eyes and sat up straight, still grinning so wide that her cheeks must have hurt. She keyed the ship-wide intercom and said, in a voice that cracked twice from suppressed laughter, that all crew should be advised we had company and that lunch service would continue as scheduled. Then she closed the channel and started laughing again, harder this time, slapping the armrest of her chair. I pulled up the detailed analysis of the Drethari fleet on my console, because that was my job, and somebody needed to be professional about this situation. I was the tactical officer aboard the junkyard dog. It was my responsibility to assess threats, calculate engagement parameters, and advise the captain on combat options. So I ran the numbers with the methodical precision that I had been trained to apply, and the numbers told a story that explained why everyone on the bridge was struggling to breathe. The Drethari flagship, a 3-kilometer dreadnought called the Throne of Embers, was the crown jewel of their fleet. It carried a focused singularity lance as its main weapon, a devastating beam of compressed gravitational force capable of cracking a planet's crust from orbit. Impressive by any standard. Its secondary armament consisted of 240 plasma lance batteries, arranged in overlapping firing arcs, each one powerful enough to melt through the hull of any known vessel in the galaxy. Also impressive, its shields were layered gravitic barriers, 16 deep, rated to absorb punishment that would turn a small moon into a cloud of superheated gravel. All of this was designed 4,000 years ago. The plasma lances used the same focusing crystals that the Drethari had invented during their third expansion period. Crystals that had not been redesigned or improved because they worked well enough against every opponent the Empire had ever faced. The shields operated on principles that had not been updated since before humanity had discovered how to make fire. The Singularity Lance was their newest weapon system, and it was 800 years old, considered cutting-edge by an empire that measured progress in millennia rather than decades. I ran the comparison against our own systems, and felt that familiar tingle that came with knowing something the other side did not know yet. Our point defense grid alone, the automated system designed to swat aside space debris and stray asteroid fragments during normal navigation, operated at energy levels that exceeded the full output of the Drethari main batteries. Not matched them, exceeded them. Our primary weapon systems, the ones we actually used when we meant business, existed in a category that the Drethari did not have a word for because they had never encountered anything like them and had never imagined they needed to. 300 years. That was all the time humanity had spent among the stars. 3 centuries compared to their 12 millennia. But we had spent those 3 centuries the way humans spend every century, which is to say we spent them building better, faster, and more creative ways to break things. We came from a planet where everything wanted to eat us, poison us, crush us, drown us, freeze us, or burn us alive, and we had responded to that environment by becoming the most creatively destructive species in biological history. When we reached the stars, we brought all of that ingenuity, all of that paranoia, and all of that relentless drive to out-engineer anything that threatened us. The Drethari had conquered 6,000 species, who had all developed along similar technological lines because they all lived on similar worlds. Garden planets with stable climates and gentle ecosystems, where the biggest survival challenge was finding enough food during a mild winter. Those species had invented weapons to hunt slow prey and fight small territorial wars. The Drethari had invented slightly better versions of the same weapons and used them to conquer everyone they met. Humanity had invented weapons to survive a world that was actively and enthusiastically trying to kill us every single day. There is a difference, and the difference was sitting on my tactical display in numbers that would have made a Drethari weapons engineer weep. I leaned back in my chair and watched the Drethari fleet hold its intimidation formation, every ship precisely positioned, every weapon aimed at our little flotilla with theatrical precision. Beautiful ships, I had to admit. Graceful lines, elegant engineering, polished hulls that reflected starlight like golden mirrors. Our fleet, by comparison, looked like 31 angry boxes that someone had welded guns onto in a hurry. The junkyard dog herself was scarred, dented, and had a patch on her port side where we had taken a micrometeorite hit 2 years ago and fixed it with whatever metal was lying around in the machine shop. We looked like garbage compared to them. But looks do not win battles. Numbers do not win battles. Pretty ships and dramatic speeches and 12,000 years of tradition do not win battles. What wins battles is the simple, cold math of who can hit harder, move faster, and think quicker. And by every metric I could measure from my console, the Draythari Ninth Grand Armada, all 412 glorious ships of it, was outclassed by any single vessel in our ragtag little flotilla. High Marshal Cathanas finished his speech with a flourish that probably sounded magnificent in his own language. There was a pause, the kind of dramatic silence that suggested he expected us to respond with terror or desperate pleas for mercy, or at least the courtesy of acknowledging that we had heard him. Instead, Captain Dominguez opened a channel and said 2 words. "That's adorable." Then she turned to Claire Barton and gave an order that I did not immediately understand, but would later recognize as one of the most brilliant tactical decisions of the engagement. She told Claire to broadcast our internal bridge camera feeds on the same open channel the Draythari were using. Every species in the galaxy that was watching this confrontation would now see the bridge of the human flagship. They would see officers eating lunch at their stations, Danny Webb dealing cards for a poker hand that he was going to lose because he always lost, Pete Gallagher showing someone pictures of his daughter's school play on his personal tablet. They would see a species that was not afraid. Not because we were pretending, not because we were putting on a brave face for the cameras, but because there was genuinely, honestly nothing on that sensor screen that warranted putting down a sandwich. I looked at the Draythari fleet one more time. All that gold and black armor, all those ancient weapons humming with power that my grandmother's generation had made obsolete before my mother was born. And I whispered to myself what every tactical officer in the human fleet was probably thinking at that exact moment. They have no idea. The hour that High Marshal Cathanas gave us to surrender was the most relaxed 60 minutes I had spent on duty in months. Captain Dominguez ordered the galley to send up fresh coffee and a selection of pastries that had just come out of the oven, and I sat at my tactical console, eating a cinnamon roll, while monitoring the Draythari fleet's increasingly agitated internal communications. They were confused. I could not blame them for that. Every sensor they had was pointed at our 31 ships, scanning us with everything they had, analyzing our hull composition and engine signatures and weapon port configurations, trying desperately to understand why we were not panicking. I could see their active sensor sweeps washing over our hull every few seconds like searchlights in a prison yard, and I imagined the Draythari analysts staring at their screens with the same expression my dog used to have when I pretended to throw a ball but kept it hidden behind my back. They could sense that something was wrong, but they could not figure out what. The problem was that our ships did not look like warships to them. Not by their standards. The Junkyard Dog was a Forge-class heavy cruiser, one of the most capable combat vessels humanity had ever built, but she looked like a cargo hauler that someone had gotten angry at and covered in armor plating out of spite. No elegant lines, no polished hull, no energy sails or decorative running lights, or any of the aesthetic touches that the Draythari considered essential markers of military power. Just a blunt, scarred, armored box, bristling with sensor arrays and weapon ports that were sealed behind thick ablative panels, designed to look like nothing more interesting than hull plating. To the Draythari, who judged military power by the beauty and size of a vessel, the same way some cultures judged wealth by the size of a house, we must have looked like a fleet of garbage scows squaring up against their grand navy. The idea that something ugly could be dangerous was genuinely foreign to their military doctrine. I pulled up the intelligence file on the Draythari Empire while I waited and skimmed through it with professional interest. It made for fascinating reading, in the same way that studying ancient cavalry charges was fascinating when you knew that machine guns existed. The Empire had expanded across the galaxy using the same basic playbook for 12,000 years without deviation. They would arrive at a new species' homeworld with an overwhelming fleet. They would deliver the subjugation speech with all its theatrical grandeur. They would demonstrate their firepower by destroying something impressive, a moon, or a space station, or an uninhabited planet. And then they would watch the target species surrender, because every single species they had ever encountered had developed along the same technological path and could see clearly that the Draythari had bigger, better versions of the same weapons everyone used. It worked every single time, because the galaxy was, technologically speaking, stagnant. Every spacefaring species used plasma weapons, Because plasma weapons were what the first spacefaring species had developed millions of years ago, and everyone who came after simply improved on the same basic design. Everyone used gravitic shields because gravitic shields were the obvious counter to plasma weapons. Everyone built ships that looked more or less the same because they were all based on the same physics, the same engineering principles, the same fundamental assumptions about what a weapon was and how a shield should work. Nobody had innovated in any meaningful way because nobody had needed to. If you had plasma weapons and gravitic shields, you could handle any threat the galaxy produced. The Dreythari had the most plasma weapons and the strongest gravitic shields, so the Dreythari won every fight. Bigger number beats smaller number. Simple, elegant, 12,000-year-old math. Humanity had not received that memo. When we reached the stars 3 centuries ago, we found a galaxy full of species using technology that our theoretical physicists had already explored, tested, and moved past in their laboratories. We looked at plasma weapons and saw their limitations. We looked at gravitic shields and saw their blind spots. We did not copy their designs or adopt their weapons because we looked at what everyone else was using and thought, with that particular brand of human paranoia that had kept us alive through ice ages and plagues and world wars and every other catastrophe our planet had thrown at us, that if everyone was using the same weapons and the same shields, then we needed something completely, fundamentally different. Something nobody would see coming. Something nobody would know how to defend against, because they had never imagined it could exist. So we built it. Quietly, without telling anyone, in shipyards buried inside asteroids and research stations, hidden in the deep black between stars, where nobody ever looked. We built weapons that operated on principles the rest of the galaxy had never explored because they had never had a reason to explore them. Kinetic accelerators that fired solid tungsten slugs at a significant fraction of the speed of light. Projectiles that no gravitic shield in the galaxy could stop because gravitic shields were designed to deflect energy, not mass. Gravity lenses that could focus gravitational forces into cutting beams, capable of slicing a ship in half from a distance that the target's sensors could not even reach. Electronic warfare suites that could hijack enemy computer systems through their own sensor arrays, turning a ship's eyes into open doors. We built shields that did not just absorb incoming energy, but redirected it, bent it around the hull, and sent it back to where it came from amplified. And we never told anyone what we had. For 300 years, we kept quiet, traded with the galaxy, smiled politely at diplomatic functions, and let every species we met assume we were exactly what we looked like, a young, small, unremarkable species, with ugly ships and a strange habit of putting condiments on everything we ate. Captain Dominguez sat in her command chair with her legs crossed and her coffee balanced on the armrest, watching the main screen where the Dreythari fleet hung in space like an angry cloud of golden wasps waiting for someone to give them permission to sting. She was not worried. I had served under her for 6 years across 3 deployments, and I had learned to read her moods the way a sailor reads the weather. When she was worried, she stood. When she was calculating, she leaned forward with her elbows on her knees. When she was completely at ease, she sat exactly the way she was sitting now, like a woman watching a mildly entertaining show on a lazy afternoon with nothing else planned. Claire Barton reported that the open broadcast was being watched across the galaxy in numbers that were still climbing. Thousands of species, billions of individual viewers. Vassal worlds of the Dreythari Empire were tuning in from every corner of the galaxy to watch their overlords crush another upstart. Client states were monitoring the feeds with quiet attention. Free species along the galactic rim were watching, with the careful interest of bystanders who wanted to know which way the wind was blowing. And all of them were seeing the same thing: a human bridge crew eating pastries, drinking coffee, and playing cards, while the most powerful armada in the known galaxy pointed 400 warships at them and counted down to annihilation. I checked the clock on my console. 40 minutes left on the ultimatum. Danny Webb asked if anyone wanted to place a bet on how long the actual engagement would take once the shooting started. Pete Gallagher thought about it for a moment, ran some numbers on his engineering console, and said 12 minutes. Claire Barton said 8. Captain Dominguez said she would buy dinner for whoever guessed closest to the actual time, then added that her personal bet was 6. I did not place a bet because I was looking at something on my tactical screen that made me grin despite my professional discipline. The Dreythari fleet's formation was textbook perfect. Every ship in precisely the right position, every firing arc calculated to create overlapping fields of plasma fire, every escape vector covered by at least 3 ships. It was beautiful military precision, the kind of formation that would have been devastating against any opponent using the same technology. Against us, it was a problem. For them, they were packed too tightly because their formation assumed that battle would be fought at plasma lance range, which meant close quarters by human standards. Our weapons had effective engagement ranges that exceeded their maximum sensor distance. We could identify, target, and hit them before they even knew we were shooting. Their beautiful formation was a gift, all those ships clustered together like targets on a firing range. 20 minutes left on the countdown. The Dreythari communication channels were buzzing with increasingly frantic chatter. I listened to the translated fragments with professional interest. Officers aboard the Imperial ships were debating what was wrong with the humans. Some thought we were insane, driven mad by the hopelessness of our situation. Others thought we had not understood the ultimatum, that perhaps our translation systems were faulty. A few proposed that it might be a cultural difference, that perhaps humans expressed fear through laughter, the way some species expressed submission through physical displays. That last theory almost made me choke on my cinnamon roll. 10 minutes left. High Marshal Cathanis broadcast another message, shorter this time, with an undercurrent of anger that his formal diction could not entirely contain. He demanded to know if humanity understood the gravity of the situation. He questioned whether our species possessed the cognitive capacity to recognize a superior military force. Captain Dominguez told Claire to broadcast our response, which consisted of Danny Webb holding up a hand-drawn sign that read, "We're good, thanks," while Pete Gallagher gave a thumbs up in the background. 5 minutes. The Dreythari fleet began powering weapons to full combat readiness. I watched the energy signatures climb on my display, hundreds of plasma lances charging simultaneously, heat blooms spreading across the fleet like a golden sunrise. I ran the calculations one more time, comparing their total combined firepower against our defensive capabilities, and the math confirmed what I already knew. Their full-power plasma lances, every single battery on every single ship in the fleet, firing simultaneously in a concentrated volley, would deliver a combined energy output roughly equivalent to what the Junkyard Dog's secondary point defense array could handle on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. The timer hit 0. High Marshal Cathanis gave the order. I did not need to speak Dreythari to understand the tone. It was the voice of a commander who was done talking, done waiting, and ready to demonstrate why his empire had ruled the galaxy for 12,000 years without a single military defeat. A warning volley erupted from the lead Dreythari ships. 200 plasma bolts streaked across the void between our fleets, brilliant golden streaks of superheated energy that looked spectacular against the black of space, trailing luminous tails like comets made of fire. It was meant to be a final warning shot, a last chance for us to come to our senses and surrender before the real barrage began. 2 of the bolts drifted slightly off course, angling toward the Junkyard Dog's port hull. Our point defense grid activated automatically with a soft hum that I felt more than heard, the same system we used to deflect space debris and micrometeorites during routine navigation. 2 tiny turrets on our starboard side, swiveled with mechanical precision, fired twice with quiet efficiency, and the plasma bolts disintegrated into harmless sparkles of dissipating energy, like soap bubbles meeting a needle. The rest of the volley flew past our fleet and dissipated harmlessly in the cold void of open space. The bridge was quiet for a moment. Then Pete Gallagher said, without looking up from his engineering console, that the point defense system had logged the engagement as a debris clearance event. It had not even categorized the incoming plasma bolts as weapons fire. The computer had treated them the same way it treated floating junk, as minor navigational nuisances to be swept aside and forgotten. Captain Dominguez set her coffee cup carefully on the magnetic holder built into her armrest. She straightened in her chair, rolling her shoulders once the way she always did before making a decision. She looked at the main screen, where 400 Dreythari warships were powering into their attack run, ancient weapons blazing golden fire, polished hulls gleaming with reflected starlight. Every gun they had pointed at our little fleet of 31 ugly, scarred, beautiful human ships. She gave one order. "Weapons free. Try not to kill anyone. I want prisoners who can tell the Emperor what happened here. I cracked my knuckles, set my console to full combat mode, felt the familiar calm settle over me like a blanket, and grinned. Finally, I said. The first thing I did was activate the electronic warfare suite, and the Drethari fleet went deaf and blind in the same heartbeat. Their communications collapsed in an instant, every frequency jammed, every channel flooded with layered noise that their systems had no idea how to filter out, because they had never encountered anything like it. 12,000 years of imperial technology had never produced electronic warfare because no species in the galaxy had ever thought to weaponize the electromagnetic spectrum the way humans did. To the Drethari, communications were sacred and untouchable, a background utility as reliable as gravity itself. No one attacked communications. It would be like attacking the laws of physics, and yet we had just turned off their ability to talk to each other, to coordinate, to share sensor data, to do anything that required one ship to speak to another. I had done it by pressing a single button. The second thing I did was paint targets. My console displayed every ship in the Drethari Armada as a detailed three-dimensional schematic, showing hull structure, weapon placement, engine configuration, shield geometry, and a dozen other data points that our sensors had been quietly mapping for the past hour, while we ate pastries and played cards. I had a better tactical picture of their fleet than their own admiral did. I tagged engine blocks, weapon capacitors, shield generators, and structural weak points on every ship within range, feeding the targeting data to our weapons systems in a steady, controlled stream that gave each battery on every ship in our fleet a precise list of what to hit and what not to hit. The third thing I did was say a quiet apology to the Drethari crews, who were about to have the worst day of their 12,000-year military history. Captain Dominguez gave the signal, and the junkyard dog fired her forward kinetic batteries. 6 solid tungsten slugs, each one about the size of a household refrigerator, and dense enough to make a black hole jealous, accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed in the space of a heartbeat. They crossed the distance between us and the nearest Drethari heavy cruiser in less time than it takes to blink. The slugs hit the cruiser's gravitic shields, the same shields that had been stopping plasma fire for 4,000 years, and passed through them as if they did not exist. Because they were not designed to stop solid mass. Gravitic shields worked by creating a field of disrupted space-time that dispersed energy-based weapons. Plasma bolts, laser beams, particle streams, anything that was fundamentally energy, got scattered and absorbed. But a solid tungsten slug was not energy. It was matter. Dense matter moving very fast. And the gravitic shield let it through the same way a chain-link fence lets a bullet through. 4,000 years of shield technology, built on the assumption that every weapon in the galaxy was energy-based, and nobody had ever tested that assumption because nobody had ever thought to just shoot a rock. The 6 slugs punched through the cruiser's hull at 6 precise points, each one targeting a critical system that I had identified and tagged during the targeting phase. Engines went dark as the propulsion system took 3 simultaneous hits in its fuel processing center. Weapon capacitors burst in contained explosions that I had calculated to disable without destroying, releasing their stored energy in safe directions that vented into space rather than into crew compartments. The shield generator shattered as a slug passed through its primary resonance crystal and kept going, exiting through the far side of the ship and continuing into empty space. In 3 seconds, a Drethari heavy cruiser that had fought in 20 campaigns and conquered 6 civilizations went from a fully operational warship to a powerless, weaponless, shieldless hulk drifting in the void. Nobody on board was dead. I had made absolutely certain of that. Captain Dominguez wanted prisoners, and I was very good at my job. Across the void, the rest of our fleet opened fire in a coordinated wave that I had timed to hit the Drethari formation from every angle simultaneously. 30 human ships engaging 400 Drethari vessels, and the numbers meant absolutely nothing. The frigate Sharptongue, smallest ship in our entire flotilla, took on 12 Drethari destroyers by herself. Her captain, a man named Leo Marsh, who had a reputation for precision that bordered on artistic obsession, disabled all 12 in under 90 seconds. Kinetic rounds punching through shields that had never been designed to stop them, electronic warfare signals scrambling navigation systems until the Drethari ships could not tell which direction they were facing, and gravity well projectors locking clusters of enemy vessels in place like insects caught in amber, unable to maneuver, unable to flee, held motionless, while Sharp-Tongue's weapons picked them apart with surgical patience. The heavy cruiser Black Mountain engaged the Draythari left flank, a formation of 60 warships that had been moving into a textbook envelopment pattern. Her weapons officer, a woman named Grace Thornton, who had won the fleet marksmanship competition 3 years running, and was so precise with a kinetic battery that people called her the surgeon, threaded tungsten slugs through the narrow gaps between Draythari ships, with accuracy that would have been impossible for anyone using manual targeting. She disabled 20 ships in the first 2 minutes of the engagement without hitting a single crew compartment, threading shots through engine rooms and weapon bays and shield generators while leaving the living spaces of each ship completely untouched. The destroyer pack led by the Rusty Nail swarmed the Draythari right flank with a speed that the Imperial ships could not track. Human destroyers were small, fast, and equipped with AI-assisted drone fighters that could make targeting decisions faster than any biological brain. Swarms of tiny unmanned craft poured from launch bays and descended on the Draythari capital ships like hornets on a bear, each one carrying precision cutting charges that could slice through specific cables and conduits without damaging the hull around them. They disabled weapons arrays, severed power conduits, and cut communication lines with a delicacy that was almost gentle. I watched the battle unfold on my tactical display and felt something I had not expected to feel, something that sat in my chest like a weight, despite the professional satisfaction of watching a flawless tactical operation. Pity. The Draythari were not cowards. I want to make that absolutely clear, because it matters to me, and it should matter to anyone who hears this story. They fought with everything they had. Their captains held formation even as ships around them went dark, maintaining discipline that spoke of centuries of military tradition and personal courage that I could not help but admire. Their gunners kept firing even though their plasma bolts splashed against our hulls and dissipated without effect, pouring shot after shot into targets that refused to be damaged. Their pilots tried evasive maneuvers that were creative and well executed, tried to find angles of attack that our weapons could not cover, tried to close to boarding range, because they must have reasoned that if their weapons could not hurt us at long range, perhaps they could overwhelm us with numbers in hand-to-hand combat. They could not have known that boarding a human ship was a hopeless proposition for any species that had not evolved on a death world. The interior of the junkyard dog was designed for creatures that had grown up in an environment of unpredictable danger. The corridors were narrow and angled to create defensive choke points. The atmospheric pressure could be adjusted section by section. The gravity plating could be turned up to 3 times standard at the touch of a button. The hatches were blast-rated against weapons that made Draythari breaching charges look like party favors. Even our emergency lighting was calibrated to a spectrum that human eyes could see perfectly in, but that Draythari eyes found disorienting and painful. Every inch of a human warship was a trap, and the Draythari who attempted to board would have found themselves fighting the ship itself as much as the crew. But they tried anyway, launching boarding pods with reckless courage toward our hull, and I respected them for it, even as our point defense grid calmly intercepted every pod before it could make contact. High Marshal Cathanis rallied his forces from the Throne of Embers, broadcasting orders on backup frequencies that our electronic warfare suite had deliberately left open. I had done that on purpose, leaving one narrow communication channel available while jamming everything else. I wanted them to be able to coordinate their surrender when the time came. I was not cruel enough to leave them completely blind and deaf while their fleet disintegrated around them, but Cathanis was not using the open channel to surrender. He was using it to reform his fleet, pulling his surviving ships together into a concentrated formation, like a spear aimed at the heart of our flotilla, specifically at the junkyard dog. It was brave. It was tactically sound given the limited information he had, and it was exactly what I would have done in his position, which was the first sign that I was dealing with a professional commander who deserved better than the situation his emperor had put him in. Captain Dominguez watched the Draythari formation tighten on the main screen, dozens of surviving warships pulling together into a dense lance, aimed directly at us. She nodded once, a small appreciative movement that acknowledged the maneuver the way one chess player acknowledges a clever move by an outmatched opponent, and told me to hold fire on the main kinetic batteries. She wanted to see what Cathanas had planned. What he had planned was the Singularity Lance. The Throne of Embers was the only ship in the Draythari fleet that carried one. It was their ultimate weapon, the crown jewel of Imperial military engineering, a focused beam of compressed gravitational force that could collapse the crust of a planet from orbit. It took 4 minutes to charge, and I watched the energy readings climb on my display as the massive Dreadnought's reactor poured everything it had into the weapon system. The other Draythari ships formed a protective shell around their flagship, shielding it while the Lance charged, absorbing the kinetic rounds and electronic warfare attacks that our fleet threw at them to buy their admiral the time he needed to fire the one weapon that he believed could turn the tide. They sacrificed themselves for their commander. Ship after ship took hits that disabled their systems so that the Throne of Embers could keep charging. It was the kind of selfless military devotion that deserved to be remembered, and I made a mental note to include it in my after-action report, because bravery like that should not be forgotten just because it happened to be on the losing side. Pete Gallagher looked up from his engineering console and asked if he should reinforce the forward defensive screens in preparation for the Singularity Lance. Captain Dominguez thought about it for a long moment, tapping her finger against the armrest of her chair, and then said no. She wanted to see what the weapon could do against our hull at full power. I stared at her. Danny Webb stared at her. Claire Barton opened her mouth to say something, then closed it and shook her head. Pete Gallagher shrugged the way he always shrugged when the captain made a decision that seemed crazy, but usually turned out to be brilliant, and went back to his console without further comment. The Singularity Lance fired. It was the single most impressive weapon discharge I had ever witnessed in my career. A beam of distorted space-time, visible to the naked eye only because of the way it bent light around itself, warping the stars behind it into streaks and spirals, crossed the distance between the Throne of Embers and the Junkyard Dog in an instant. It hit us dead center, right on the bow, with enough focused gravitational force to crack a continent in half and turn a mountain range into a crater. The bridge shook, hard. My console rattled so violently that every unsecured object on its surface went flying. My replacement coffee mug, the one I had gotten after the first one, fell, launched itself off the edge, and shattered on the deck plating. I grabbed the armrest of my chair with both hands to keep from being thrown sideways. Alarms blared from every station, red lights flashing in sequences I had never seen before, warning systems screaming about hull stress and gravitational anomalies, and structural integrity fluctuations. The sound was physical, a deep resonant boom, like standing inside a cathedral bell while someone hit it with the biggest hammer ever forged. 3 seconds later, the alarms went silent. The shaking stopped. The red lights turned green one by one as automated damage control systems reported in from every section of the ship. I pulled up the damage report with hands that I will admit were not entirely steady. Minor scoring on the outer ablative hull layer. A 3-centimeter hairline crack in the forward sensor housing cover plate. One external antenna array that had been knocked 2 degrees out of alignment. The most powerful weapon in the Draythari Empire, the gun that had cracked planets and broken civilizations, and stood as the ultimate symbol of imperial military supremacy for 800 years, had scratched our paint. The bridge erupted. Danny Webb fell out of his chair, laughing so hard that he knocked his head on the navigation console and kept laughing. Claire Barton had tears streaming down her face, making sounds that were halfway between laughter and hiccups. Pete Gallagher was bent over his engineering station, making a noise that could only be described as a wheeze that had given up trying to be a laugh, and settled for just being loud. Even Captain Dominguez, who had deliberately let the hit land to prove a point to the billions of viewers watching the broadcast, was laughing so hard she had to grip the armrests of her chair to stay seated. I sat in my chair, looking at the damage report on one screen and the Draythari dreadnought that had just fired its best shot on the other, and I started laughing too. Not because the situation was funny. It was not funny. It was deeply, profoundly not funny. The Draythari had just thrown the most powerful weapon they possessed at us, and it had done nothing, and that meant their entire civilization's understanding of military power was built on weapons that were obsolete by centuries. 12,000 years of conquest, 6,000 subjugated species, an empire that spanned the galaxy, and they were armed with antiques. It was not funny, it was tragic, but we laughed anyway, Because that is what humans do when the tension breaks, when the danger turns out to be less than advertised, when the monster under the bed turns out to be a cat that got lost in the house. The Drathari fleet went quiet, not the quiet of jammed communications, because I had left that one channel open. The quiet of 400 ship crews watching their most powerful weapon fail completely and trying to process what that failure meant for everything they had believed about their place in the universe. Then the surrender beacons started lighting up. One at first, a small destroyer on the edge of the formation, her captain making the professional assessment that courage had limits, but wisdom did not. Then 2 more. Then 10. Then clusters of ships, whole squadrons, powering down their weapons and broadcasting the universal signal for capitulation that every spacefaring species recognized. I watched the surrender beacons appear on my tactical display, like stars waking up at dusk, spreading across the Drathari fleet, in a wave that grew faster with each passing second. In 5 minutes, over 300 ships had surrendered. Their captains were not cowards, they were professionals, who had spent their careers learning to read tactical situations, and the tactical situation was telling them in the clearest possible terms that this fight had been over before the first shot was fired. But High Marshal Cathanis did not surrender. The Throne of Embers fought on alone, the last ship still firing, surrounded by the drifting, powerless hulks of its own fleet, shields flickering and failing one layer at a time, plasma lances firing in every direction with desperate intensity. Cathanis threw everything his ship had at us, every weapon, every reserve of power, every trick that 12,000 years of military tradition had taught him, and the junkyard dog absorbed all of it, the way a mountain absorbs rain. He tried ramming speed, pushing his engines beyond their safety limits to close the distance for a collision, and we sidestepped him with a casual thruster adjustment. He launched boarding pods in waves, and our point defense swatted them aside without breaking from its standard operating rhythm. He even tried a second singularity lance shot, pouring every remaining joule of energy his reactor could produce into one final desperate blast, and this time, Pete Gallagher did not even bother looking up from his console. Captain Dominguez watched the dreadnought's increasingly desperate attack with an expression that I had never seen on her face in 6 years of service. It was not amusement, it was not pity, it was not satisfaction or contempt, or any of the things you might expect from a commander watching an enemy struggle helplessly. It was respect. Pure, clean, undiluted professional respect for a military commander who knew with absolute certainty that he had lost and refused to stop fighting, because surrender was not something he knew how to do. She opened a direct channel to the Throne of Embers, overriding our own jamming on that one frequency. When she spoke, her voice was calm, steady, and warm, with no trace of laughter or triumph. "High Marshal Cathanis," she said, "your conduct today has been noted and will be recorded with honor. Your courage is beyond question, and your devotion to your duty is something that any officer in any fleet would respect. But your crew does not deserve to die for an emperor who sent them into this fight without understanding what they were facing. Stand down. You have my word as an officer that you and your people will be treated with every dignity your service has earned." Silence stretched across the void between our ships. The dreadnought's weapons kept firing, but the shots were growing weaker as the ship's overworked reactor struggled to maintain power output under the strain of continuous operation. Shields were failing layer by layer, peeling away under the steady, precise pressure of our weapons, which were calibrated to strip defenses without penetrating the hull beneath them. Then Cathanis responded. His voice was deep and steady, carrying the weight of a commander who had led fleets across the galaxy, who had never known defeat in a career spanning decades, who had watched his invincible armada disintegrate in 40 minutes, and was still trying to understand how that was possible. "What are you?" he asked. The question hung in the silence of the bridge like smoke after a fire. It was not a request for species identification. It was not a tactical query about our military capabilities. It was something far deeper than that, something that came from a place in Cathanis that had just watched everything he believed about the universe, about power, about the natural order of civilizations, collapse into rubble around him. I felt a chill run down my spine despite the warmth of the bridge, because I recognized that question. Every species asked it eventually. Every civilization that encountered humanity for the first time, that saw what we could do, that realized we were something the galaxy had never produced before and had no framework to understand, asked that same question, in that same voice, with that same mixture of awe and confusion, and something that was not quite fear, but lived in the same neighborhood. "What are you?" Captain Dominguez did not answer right away. She looked at the main screen, at the battered dreadnought still fighting with its last reserves of power and courage. She looked at the Draythari surrender beacons, dotting her tactical display, like a field of white flowers. She looked at the broadcast indicator blinking steadily, reminding her that thousands of species across an entire galaxy were watching this moment and listening for her answer. "We're human," she said simply, "and we'd really like to stop shooting now." The throne of embers went quiet. Weapons, powered down one battery at a time. Shields dropped with a shimmer that looked almost grateful. The surrender beacon activated, a soft white pulse on my display, and across the void, the battle was over. I checked the clock on my console. 41 minutes from first shot to last. Danny Webb won the dinner bet by coming closest without going under, and he was insufferable about it for weeks afterward. I spent the next 3 days processing prisoners, and by the end of it, I understood the Draythari better than any human probably should have. The battle had been decisive in a way that went far beyond simple military victory. 412 ships disabled or surrendered. Every single vessel in the 9th Grand Armada accounted for. 0 destroyed, 0 human casualties. The only deaths in the entire engagement were 14 Draythari crew members who had been killed by internal system failures aboard their own ships, overloaded capacitors, and ruptured power conduits that had nothing to do with human weapons, and everything to do with aging systems pushed beyond their design limits. I made sure that detail went into every official report because it mattered. We had fought a fleet 400 strong with 31 ships, and had not killed a single enemy combatant with our weapons. Every shot we fired was a precision instrument, not a hammer. Captain Dominguez transferred the Draythari prisoners to the colony station at New Anchorage, where we had the facilities and the space to house them properly. She gave strict orders that they were to be treated as honored guests rather than captives. Quarters were comfortable and configured for Draythari physiology. Food was prepared according to dietary requirements that our intelligence files had on record, sourced from supplies that the colony had stocked as a contingency. Medical teams treated the wounded, mostly burns and concussions from their own failing systems, with the same care and attention they would have given our own crew. I was assigned to debrief the captured officers, which was how I found myself sitting across a table from a Draythari sub-commander named Fail on the second day after the engagement. Fail was tall, nearly 2.5 meters, with the blue-gray skin and 4-jointed arms that were typical of his species. He sat rigidly upright in a chair that our maintenance crew had modified to accommodate his broader frame and longer torso, and he looked at me with eyes that held the hollow stare of someone whose entire understanding of reality had been turned inside out and shaken until nothing recognizable remained. I set a cup of something that our kitchen staff had done their best to approximate from Draythari recipes in front of him. He looked at it. He looked at me. He did not drink it. "Ask your questions, human," he said, his voice coming through the translator flat and controlled, stripped of everything except professional composure. "I will answer what honor permits." I told him I did not have questions, not the kind he was expecting. I was not there to extract military intelligence or interrogate him about fleet deployments or probe for weaknesses in imperial defenses. I was there because I wanted to understand his perspective on what had happened, and because Captain Dominguez believed that understanding was worth more than any amount of tactical information. Fail stared at me for a long time, his 4-jointed fingers resting motionless on the table. Then he picked up the cup and took a careful, deliberate sip. Whatever our kitchen had produced, it was apparently close enough to acceptable. "You want to know why we came?" he said. I told him I knew why they came. The Emperor sent them, but I wanted to know what they had expected to happen when they arrived. What the plan had been. What victory was supposed to look like. "What always happens," Fail said, setting down the cup with precise care. "What has always happened, for 12,000 years, without exception. We arrive. We demonstrate strength. The lesser species sees the futility of resistance and submits. The empire grows. It is the natural order of the galaxy. He paused, and I saw something shift behind his eyes, something breaking loose from its foundation. It has never failed, not once in 12 millennia. Every species we have encountered, from the most primitive to the most advanced, has followed the same path. First defiance born of ignorance, then fear born of understanding, then submission born of survival. The path is inevitable, because the math is inevitable. We have more ships. We have more weapons. We have more experience. The outcome is predetermined, before the first shot is fired. I asked him what happened when they realized the math was wrong. Fail set down his cup with a click that sounded very loud in the small room. His four-jointed hands rested flat on the table, and I noticed for the first time that they were trembling with a fine, constant vibration that he could not control. "We saw your ships," he said slowly, each word measured and careful. "Small things. Ugly things. No grace. No beauty. No indication of military power by any standard we recognized. We thought you were scavengers, primitives, who had stumbled into spaceflight aboard converted mining vessels and cargo haulers. Our analysts rated your entire fleet as a negligible threat, below the threshold that would normally warrant a full armada response. Our weapons officers calculated that a single concentrated volley from the forward batteries would be more than sufficient to disable every ship in your flotilla simultaneously." He paused again, longer this time, and the trembling in his hands grew worse. "Then you laughed." He looked at me directly, and his eyes were not hollow anymore. They were burning with something that I recognized because I had seen it in the eyes of every person who had ever had their certainties destroyed. Not anger, not shame, something worse than both. The raw, disorienting confusion of someone who has just discovered that the ground they have been standing on their entire life was never solid to begin with. "You laughed at us. We have been feared by 6,000 species across 12,000 years. We have been worshipped as gods by civilizations that existed before your world had oceans. We have been the hand that shapes the galaxy, the voice that commands obedience from every corner of known space. And you laughed. Do you have any concept of what that felt like? To stand on the bridge of a warship that has never known defeat, surrounded by the greatest fleet your civilization has ever assembled, and hear an alien species laughing at you, as if you had told them an amusing story." I told him I could imagine how disorienting that must have been. "No," he said firmly, "you cannot, because you have never been the species that everyone fears. You have never built your entire civilization, your entire identity, your entire understanding of your place in the universe, on the certainty that you are the strongest, the most advanced, the most powerful thing in existence. And you have never had that certainty obliterated in 40 minutes by 31 ships that look like they were assembled from salvage." I let the silence hold for a moment, letting his words settle. Then I told him something that I had been thinking about since the engagement ended, something that I believed was more important than any tactical detail or military analysis. I told him that humanity did not want empire. We did not want subjects or tribute or submission or worship. We did not want to replace the Draethari as rulers of the galaxy. We wanted to be left alone to eat our sandwiches and play our card games, and argue about whose turn it was to clean the atmospheric recycling filters. We had not come to the stars looking for species to conquer. We had come because we were curious about what was out there, and because sitting still made us nervous in a way that was probably a side effect of evolving on a planet where staying in one place too long usually meant something was about to eat you. Fail did not believe me. I could see the disbelief on his face, as clearly as if he had spoken it aloud. "Every powerful species wants dominion," he said with the conviction of someone stating a law of physics. "That is the only truth the galaxy has ever known. Power exists to be used. Strength exists to command obedience. It is the fundamental equation of civilization." I told him that was the only truth the galaxy had known so far. He drank the rest of his cup in silence, processing that statement with the careful attention of a man who suspects he is hearing something important but cannot yet determine what it means. Then he asked me what was going to happen to him and his crew. I told him the truth, the full truth, without qualification or diplomatic softening. They would be held comfortably until diplomatic channels could be established with the Draythari government, and then they would be transported home. No conditions attached, no ransom demanded, no territory claimed, no concessions extracted. Just a ride back to Draythari space, and a handshake at the border. He looked at me like I had just told him that gravity had decided to take the afternoon off. That evening, I was on the bridge monitoring long-range galactic communications when Claire Barton flagged something on the network feeds. The open broadcast of our engagement had spread across the galaxy far further and faster than any of us had anticipated. It had been copied, rebroadcast, translated into thousands of languages, and shared across every communication network that connected the civilizations of known space. Billions of beings on thousands of worlds had watched the Draythari Ninth Grand Armada, the finest military force in 12,000 years of Imperial history, get completely dismantled by 31 human ships in under an hour, without a single human casualty, and without killing a single Draythari combatant. Reaction across the galaxy was seismic. On Draythari vassal worlds, species that had been subjugated for centuries or millennia were rising up. Not in violent revolution, but in something more powerful. They were simply refusing to obey, refusing to pay tribute, refusing to acknowledge the authority of Draythari governors who had ruled their worlds since before their grandparents were born. It was the kind of uprising that starts not with weapons, but with the sudden, collective realization that the thing you have feared for your entire existence is not as fearsome as you were told. The Draythari military had maintained order across 6,000 conquered civilizations through one elegant, ruthless mechanism, the belief that resistance was futile. The absolute certainty, reinforced by 12,000 years of unbroken military success, that defying the Empire meant destruction and submission meant survival. The Ninth Grand Armada was supposed to be living proof of that certainty. Instead, it had become proof of exactly the opposite. Liberation movements that had been dormant for generations were stirring awake. Underground cultural networks that had secretly maintained forbidden traditions, suppressed languages, and hidden histories were going public for the first time. On 3 separate vassal worlds, local populations had walked calmly into Draythari administrative buildings and politely informed the garrison commanders that their services were no longer required and that they were welcome to leave peacefully. The Empire was trembling, not from any military attack, but from the simple, devastating demonstration that it could be defied and the sky would not fall. I reported all of this to Captain Dominguez, who listened carefully to every detail, nodded once, and said she needed to make some calls. She disappeared into her private office for 4 hours, and when she emerged, her expression had changed in a way that immediately put me on alert. The amusement was gone. The relaxed confidence was gone. What replaced it was something harder, sharper, something I had only seen once before during a training exercise that had gone catastrophically wrong and required her to make life-or-death decisions with incomplete information and no time to second-guess. She called the bridge crew together. Danny Webb, Claire Barton, Pete Gallagher, and me. She told us to sit down, and she did not offer coffee, which was how I knew the news was serious. I just received a tight beam transmission from the Draythari homeworld, she said. Autarch Varentis himself has responded to the loss of the Ninth Grand Armada. She played the recording. The Autarch's voice filled the bridge, cold and precisely measured, without the theatrical grandiosity of Cathanis. He did not threaten, he did not bluster, he did not invoke the fire of empire or the weight of history. He spoke with the calm, terrifying certainty of a ruler who had held absolute power for longer than most species in the galaxy had existed as civilized beings. He announced the mobilization of the entire Draythari Imperial military, all 40 Grand Armadas, over 16,000 warships, every vessel, every soldier, every weapon system in the Imperial arsenal, drawn from every corner of an empire that spanned the galaxy, assembled and aimed at human space with a single, clearly stated purpose. He called it a cleansing. The bridge was absolutely silent when the recording ended. Danny Webb had stopped shuffling his cards for the first time since I had known him. Claire Barton's perpetual half-smile had vanished entirely. Pete Gallagher was staring at his engineering console with an expression that told me he was already running calculations in his head, working through reactor output numbers and ammunition reserves and repair cycle estimates. Captain Dominguez let the silence sit for exactly the right amount of time, long enough to let the weight of what we had heard settle into our bones, but not long enough for the weight to become fear. 40 fleets, 16,000 ships, headed our way. She paused. Better call home. Tell them to wake up the mothball fleet. I pulled up the mothball fleet registry on my console. It was a database I had seen referenced in strategic briefings and fleet readiness reports, but had never personally needed to access during active service. The registry was a comprehensive listing of every human warship that had been built, tested, fully armed, and then placed in deep preservation storage across human space over the course of the past 3 centuries. Ships sitting in sealed orbital yards and hollowed-out asteroid hangars, and underground docks carved into the bedrock of a dozen colony worlds. Ships that had been constructed and mothballed because humanity had always known, with that deep, bone-level paranoid certainty that ran through our species like a vein of iron through granite, that someday, something out here would come for us, and we would need to be ready. The number on the screen was 11,400. 11,400 warships, all of them built with newer technology than anything in the Drethari fleet, all of them armed with weapons systems that the rest of the galaxy did not know existed, all of them ready to be activated, crewed by reservists and volunteers who had trained for exactly this kind of scenario during their years of mandatory military service. I let out a slow breath that fogged my console screen in the cool air of the bridge and leaned back in my chair. The number sat there on the display, glowing softly, impossibly large and impossibly real. This is going to be something, I said. 6 weeks later, I stood on the bridge of the Junkyard Dog and watched humanity prepare for the largest military confrontation in the history of the galaxy. We had returned to core human space after the engagement at New Anchorage, and the transformation that greeted us was staggering, in a way that made everything I thought I knew about my own civilization feel inadequate. I had grown up in the military. I had spent my entire adult life on warships, training for combat, studying tactical doctrine, and preparing for the theoretical day when humanity would face a threat significant enough to require more than a single patrol flotilla. I thought I understood the scale of what we had built. I thought I understood what human military capability looked like when it was fully mobilized. I understood nothing. The mothball fleet was coming awake, and watching it happen was like watching a sleeping giant open its eyes and stretch. Across dozens of star systems scattered throughout human-controlled space, orbital shipyards that had been cold and dark for decades were lighting up, their massive construction frames blazing with activity, as maintenance crews swarmed through corridors that had been sealed since before I was born. Preservation docks carved into the hearts of asteroids were unsealing for the first time in 30 years, releasing warships that had been held in perfect stasis, every system maintained by automated caretakers that had been faithfully performing their duties in the darkness for longer than most of their future crews had been alive. I watched from the main observation window as a Sentinel-class battleship, twice the length of the Junkyard Dog and 4 times her mass, drifted slowly past our docking position on its way to the fleet assembly point. Its hull was pristine, unblemished by combat or age, fresh from 3 decades of sealed preservation that had kept it in factory-new condition. Its weapon arrays were cold but intact, row upon row of kinetic batteries and gravity lances and electronic warfare emitters that had never been fired in anger, every one of them tested and certified, and waiting for the day they would be needed. Behind it came another Sentinel, and another, and another, an endless procession of warships emerging from their long sleep and joining the stream of vessels converging on the rally point. In the first week of mobilization, human space went from 31 active warships to over 4,000. By the end of the second week, the number crossed 7,000, as more distant mothball yards completed their activation sequences. By week 3, the count exceeded 9,000 and was still climbing. By the end of the 5th week, when the last of the preserved ships had been brought online and crewed, 11,000 warships were active and operational, and moving into defensive positions across the frontier of human space. The crews came from everywhere. Reservists poured in from every colony, every orbital station, every mining outpost and research facility in human territory. Men and women who had completed their mandatory military service years or decades ago, and gone on to civilian lives as engineers and teachers and farmers and artists, were pulling their uniforms out of storage, reporting to their assigned vessels, and picking up where they had left off, with a competence that spoke of training so thorough it survived years of disuse. They came without being forced. Nobody was drafted. Nobody was conscripted. They came because the call went out, and because they were human, and because answering that call when it came was something that every one of them had always known they would do. The energy throughout the fleet was different from New Anchorage. Completely, fundamentally different. Nobody was laughing now. There were no pastries on the bridge, no poker games during downtime, no casual disregard for the incoming threat. What replaced the laughter was something I can only describe as focus. The deep, quiet, steady, absolute focus of a species that had been preparing for this specific moment for 300 years without knowing exactly when it would arrive. It was not fear. It was not anxiety. It was the concentration of 1 billion people who understood exactly what was at stake and had decided, collectively and without discussion, that they were going to do this right. Captain Dominguez was promoted to Commodore and given command of the 7th Strike Group, 48 warships including the Junkyard Dog as her flagship. She accepted the promotion with a brief nod, pinned the new rank insignia to her collar, and went straight back to work without any celebration or ceremony because there was too much to do and too little time to do it in. I was promoted along with her, elevated from Ship Tactical Officer to Strike Group Tactical Coordinator, which meant I now had responsibility for coordinating weapons fire, electronic warfare operations, and targeting priorities across all 48 ships in the group, instead of just one. It was the most terrifying career advancement of my life, a jump in responsibility so enormous that I lay awake my first night in the new role, staring at the ceiling and wondering if I was ready. I handled the doubt the way I handle everything that scares me, which was to sit down with a large cup of coffee and start making organized lists. Our intelligence networks had been feeding us information since the day after New Anchorage, and the picture they painted of the Draythari mobilization was both impressive and revealing. Human operatives who had been embedded in galactic trade routes and diplomatic circuits for decades, quiet, patient professionals who moved through alien marketplaces and government functions, gathering information that might someday prove valuable, were now proving their worth many times over. Reports flooded in from across the galaxy in a continuous stream, each one adding detail and nuance to our understanding of what was coming. The Autarch was assembling his armadas at a staging point in the Vorthax system, a military hub deep in the heart of Imperial space. 40 grand armadas, 16,000 warships in total, crewed by millions of Draythari soldiers, and supported by supply chains that stretched across half the galaxy. It was the largest military mobilization in the recorded history of the known universe. The Autarch was committing everything, holding nothing in reserve, putting every chip on the table in a single massive bet that overwhelming numbers would succeed where the 9th Armada had failed. But the intelligence reports also revealed something that changed the entire strategic equation. The Empire was fracturing from within. The broadcast of our engagement at New Anchorage had not merely inspired hope on vassal worlds. It had ignited something far more dangerous to the Empire than any external military threat. It had ignited belief. Not belief in humanity specifically, but belief in the possibility that the Draythari could be defied without being destroyed. For 12,000 years, the Empire had maintained control through the absolute, unquestioned certainty that resistance was futile. Our battle had shattered that certainty, and in the cracks, something was growing. Vassal species were refusing to supply troops for the mobilization. Worlds that had been forced to contribute soldiers and ships to the Imperial military for generations were simply declining to participate, their governments issuing polite but firm refusals that would have been unthinkable 6 weeks earlier. Slave worlds that had been compelled to manufacture weapons and ammunition for the Empire were shutting down their production lines, their workforces walking away from the factories and going home. Transport networks that the Draythari depended on to move supplies and reinforcements across their vast territory were being sabotaged, not through violence but through the simple refusal of the vassal species who operated them to continue doing so. The Autarch was pulling military forces from occupation duties to fill the gaps in his armadas. stripping garrisons from conquered worlds to crew the ships that vassal crews had refused to serve on. Every garrison he weakened was another world that slipped out of imperial control, another population that tasted freedom for the first time in centuries, and decided they liked the flavor. It was a spiral that was accelerating with every passing day, each freed world inspiring others to follow, each weakened garrison making the next rebellion easier. I presented this intelligence to Commodore Dominguez during a tactical briefing aboard the Junkyard Dog. She listened to the entire analysis without interrupting, studying the holographic map of the galaxy that showed the Draythari Empire as a vast golden sphere with hairline fractures spreading across its surface, like cracks in ice, that was trying to hold more weight than it could bear. "They are coming apart," she said quietly when I finished. "And they do not know it yet, or they know and cannot stop it." The Draythari armadas entered human space on a Tuesday morning, by Fleet Standard Time. I remember that detail because I had just finished a breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast when the long-range sensor array picked up the hyperspace signatures. The display bloomed with contacts. 16,214 vessels, pouring out of hyperspace in a wave formation that stretched across 3 light minutes of space, an ocean of golden hulls and ancient weapons, bearing down on human territory, with the full weight and fury of an empire that had never lost, and could not afford to lose now. Our fleet was waiting for them. 11,000 human warships, arranged in a layered defensive formation at the edge of our territory, every ship crewed and ready, every weapon system charged and calibrated, every electronic warfare suite tuned and tested. We were outnumbered by more than 5,000 ships, but numbers were even less meaningful now than they had been at New Anchorage. The technological gap had not closed in 6 weeks. If anything, the mothball fleet ships were even more advanced than the vessels we had used in the first engagement, built more recently with more refined versions of the same revolutionary technology. But Commodore Dominguez had not assembled 11,000 warships just to fight a bigger version of the same battle. She had a different plan entirely, one that she had been building piece by piece since the day after New Anchorage, and when she finally explained it to the strike group commanders during a fleet-wide briefing, I understood why she had been promoted, and I understood why the Admiralty had given her tactical command of the entire operation. Behind our defensive formation, positioned carefully in locations where the Draythari long-range sensors would eventually detect them, was a second fleet. Not warships. Civilian vessels. Hundreds of unarmed transports, commercial freighters, and communication ships, each one carrying broadcast equipment powerful enough to reach every inhabited corner of the galaxy simultaneously. Claire Barton had spent 3 weeks assembling and configuring the broadcast network, coordinating with civilian communications companies and military signal corps units to create a system that could transmit high-definition audio and video to billions of receivers across thousands of light years. When she reported that the network was fully operational and ready to go live, she did so with a grin that told me she knew exactly what the Commodore was planning, and she approved completely. The open broadcast went live. Once again, the galaxy was watching. Autarch Vorentis himself had traveled with the invasion fleet, joining the armada aboard his personal Imperial flagship, a vessel of such staggering size that our sensors had initially classified it as a small moon before the identification algorithms corrected themselves. He broadcast one final demand across every available frequency, his cold, measured voice reaching not just our fleet and our territory, but every corner of his own fracturing empire. Submit, kneel, or be erased from history. Commodore Dominguez responded on the same open channel, but she did not address the autarch. She spoke to everyone else. "This message is for every species listening to this broadcast across the galaxy," she said, her voice steady and clear, carrying the calm authority of someone who understood exactly what this moment meant, and exactly what was at stake. "For 12,000 years, you have lived under the shadow of an empire that told you resistance was impossible. That defiance meant annihilation. That submission was the only path to survival, and that any other choice was madness." She paused, and on the communication monitors in front of me, I watched the listening indicators spike across every sector of the galaxy. Every vassal world, every client state, every occupied territory, every free species, Every corner of known space was tuning in to hear what came next. 6 weeks ago, 31 of our ships faced 400 of theirs. We did not bow, we did not kneel, we did not beg or bargain or plead. We laughed. And then we won, without taking a single life. Not because we are stronger than you, or braver, or more advanced, but because we refuse to be afraid. We looked at the power that has held this galaxy in chains for 12,000 years, and we refused to be impressed by it. She leaned forward in her command chair, and her voice shifted, dropping to something quieter, something more personal, something that felt less like a military broadcast, and more like a conversation between people who understood each other's pain. Today, 16,000 ships have come to our doorstep to teach us the same lesson that every species in this galaxy has already learned. That the Empire cannot be beaten, that resistance is futile, that you should accept your chains and be grateful for them because the alternative is worse. She shook her head slowly, deliberately, making sure the gesture would be visible on every screen across every world. We are here to tell you that is a lie. It has always been a lie. The Empire is not invincible. It is old, and it is tired, and it is held together by nothing more substantial than the belief that it cannot be broken. We broke it once. We are going to break it again. Right now. Right here. And you are going to watch. She straightened up in her chair, and her voice rose. Not to a shout, not to theatrical volume, just enough to carry the simple, absolute force of complete conviction. You do not need to be human to defy tyranny. You do not need our weapons or our ships or our technology. All you need is the willingness to stand up and say no. The Empire cannot punish all of you. It cannot occupy every world simultaneously. It cannot crush every act of defiance. If you rise, all of you, together, the Empire falls. Not because we defeated it, because you stopped holding it up. She closed the channel. The broadcast indicator continued blinking, confirming that the civilian fleet was maintaining the feed, transmitting everything that happened next to an audience of billions. The silence on the bridge lasted 4 seconds. Then the Draythari fleet opened fire, and the galaxy answered. The first sign came from the Draythari left flank, a cluster of warships crewed by a vassal species called the Thanari, a civilization that had been conquered and absorbed into the Empire 3,000 years ago, suddenly powered down their weapons. Every gun on every Thanari crewed vessel went cold simultaneously, a coordinated decision made without hesitation. The ships reversed course, turning away from the human fleet, and broadcast a simple message in their own language, that our translation systems rendered as 2 words. We are done. Then the right flank answered. A squadron of heavy cruisers crewed by the Voss, a species that had served the Empire as shock troops and frontline soldiers for 5,000 years, paying in blood for the privilege of existing under Draythari rule, turned their guns on the Imperial command vessels beside them and fired. Not at full power, not to destroy. Warning shots that seared across golden hulls and left scorched lines in the polished armor. A message that needed no translation in any language. Then the center wavered, then the rear guard, then the supply lines. Ship after ship, squadron after squadron, armada after armada, the vassal forces that comprised nearly half of the Draythari invasion fleet stopped fighting for the Empire and started fighting against it. 12,000 years of accumulated grievance and suppressed defiance erupted in a single, cascading wave of mutiny that spread through the Imperial formation faster than any weapon could have done. The autarch 16,000-ship invasion force tore itself apart from the inside out. Our fleet barely fired a shot. Commodore Dominguez gave the order to engage only the pure Draythari vessels, the ones crewed entirely by Imperial citizens who remained loyal to the autarch, and even then, she demanded the same precision and the same restraint that we had maintained at New Anchorage. Disable, do not destroy. Capture, do not kill. Preserve life wherever possible, even the lives of enemies who were still trying to destroy us. I coordinated weapons fire across our entire strike group, threading kinetic rounds between mutinying vassal ships and Draythari loyalists, maintaining fire discipline in a tactical environment so complex and chaotic that a single misidentified target could have turned an ally into an enemy. It was the most demanding, most exhausting, most technically challenging tactical problem I had ever faced, and I solved it one target at a time, one carefully aimed shot at a time, while the galaxy rearranged itself around me in real time. The engagement, if it could be called an engagement, lasted less than 2 hours from the first Thenari defection to the last Draythari surrender. When it was over, the Draythari Empire had ceased to exist as a functioning military power. 8,000 vassal-crewed ships had mutinied. 6,000 Draythari vessels had been disabled by human weapons. The remaining 2,000 had surrendered when their crews recognized that they were surrounded by former subjects who had just discovered that the chains they had worn for millennia were made of nothing more substantial than fear and tradition. The Autarch's flagship went dark last. I watched it on my tactical display, the massive vessel drifting without power, its weapons cold, its shields gone, its golden hull scarred and darkened by impacts that had stripped away its polished exterior to reveal the plain gray metal underneath. The surrender beacon did not activate from the command bridge. It activated from the lower decks, from the service levels and maintenance bays where the ship's vassal crew, servants, and laborers and technicians who had been forced to maintain the vessel and serve its Draythari officers for generations, had seized control of critical systems and locked the Autarch in his own throne room. The Emperor of the Draythari Galactic Empire, ruler of 6,000 worlds, commander of the most powerful military force in the history of civilization, was taken prisoner by the species he had enslaved. Not by humans, not by our weapons or our ships or our technology, by the people he had held in chains who had finally, after 12,000 years, decided that they did not want to wear them anymore. Commodore Dominguez sat back in her command chair and let out a long, slow breath that seemed to empty her completely. The bridge was quiet. The tactical display was a chaos of disabled ships and blinking surrender beacons and open communication channels broadcasting in 100 different languages, but the shooting was done, and the silence that followed was the deepest silence I had ever heard. Across the galaxy, something extraordinary was happening. On worlds we had never visited, among species we had never met, whose names we might never learn, liberation bells were ringing. I do not mean that as a figure of speech. Dozens of civilizations had ancient traditions of ringing bells or sounding horns, or singing specific songs when freedom came, traditions that had been suppressed and forbidden for thousands of years, and now those bells were ringing, and those horns were sounding, and those songs were being sung for the first time in living memory. Danny Webb was sitting at his navigation console, with tears rolling silently down his face, listening to the translated broadcasts coming in from across the galaxy. Claire Barton was laughing and crying simultaneously, unable to choose between the two responses, and so doing both with equal intensity. Pete Gallagher had his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking, overwhelmed by the scale of what we had just been part of. I sat at my tactical console, staring at the display that showed the remains of the largest military operation in galactic history, trying to process the reality of what had happened. We had come prepared for the biggest battle humanity had ever faced. We had brought 11,000 warships, armed with weapons that could have torn the Draythari fleet to pieces in minutes. And in the end, we had won by talking. Not by talking the enemy into surrender, by talking the galaxy into freedom. I laughed. Not the confident, dismissive laughter of New Anchorage, not the startled amusement of watching our paint survive a planet-cracking weapon. This was something entirely different. This was the laughter of relief, of astonishment, of a man who had prepared for a war and instead witnessed a revolution unfold in real time, while he sat at his console trying to keep up. Commodore Dominguez looked at me from across the bridge and smiled. It was a tired smile, the kind that comes after weeks of relentless tension finally releasing all at once, leaving you emptied out but somehow lighter than you have felt in a very long time. "Log it, Ren," she said quietly. I opened my personal log and stared at the blinking cursor for a long time, listening to the bells that were still ringing across 1,000 worlds, trying to find words that were adequate for what had happened. Then I started writing. They asked us what we are. Not once, but 100 times, in 100 languages, on 100 worlds. Every species that encountered us, every civilization that watched us stand where others had always knelt. Every commander who looked at our ugly ships and our messy uniforms, and our bizarre habit of eating sandwiches in the middle of tactical situations, asked the same question in the same bewildered, awestruck voice. What are you? I think I finally have an answer. We are the species that looked at the biggest empire the galaxy had ever seen, 12,000 years of fear and obedience and unchallenged dominion, and laughed. Not because we are braver than other species, not because we are stronger, though our ships proved that beyond any doubt. We laughed because we have been fighting ourselves for so long that nothing out here scares us anymore. We spent thousands of years on a planet that tried every day to kill us in new and creative ways, and then we spent thousands more years trying to kill each other with equal creativity. And by the time we finally reached the stars and looked around at the galaxy, we had already survived everything the universe knows how to throw at a living species, and we came out the other side still standing, still stubborn, still hungry. The Draythari built an empire on fear. We built a fleet on paranoia. The difference matters because fear turns you into a tyrant who needs everyone smaller than you to kneel, while paranoia turns you into a species that builds 11,000 warships and hides them inside asteroids just in case. We were prepared for the worst because preparing for the worst is what we do. It is coded into our bones and written into our history and baked into every decision we have ever made as a civilization. We were so prepared that when the biggest armada in galactic history showed up at our doorstep, our primary concern was making sure we had enough coffee for the engagement. But here is the thing that matters most. The thing I want anyone who reads this log to understand and remember. We did not win because we fought better, although we did. We did not win because we had superior technology, although we do. We won because we showed the galaxy that fighting was not necessary. The Draythari Empire was a house of cards, held together by nothing but the shared belief of 6,000 species that it could not be knocked down. We did not knock it down. We just showed everyone watching that you could touch it without being struck by divine fire, and they knocked it down themselves. Every species that ever knelt to the Draythari did so because they believed with absolute certainty that they had no choice. We gave them a choice. That is the most human thing we could have done, because if there is one lesson that runs through our entire bloody, chaotic, magnificent history as a species, it is that no one should ever have to kneel. Not to an empire, not to a tyrant, not to anyone who claims that might makes right and that power is its own justification. We came to the stars carrying every mistake we had ever made, every war we had ever fought, every failure and every triumph, and every stupid, brutal, beautiful lesson that our species had learned the hard way across millennia of struggle. And the most important of all those lessons, the one that cost us the most blood and the most tears to learn, was this: nobody is too small to stand up, and nobody is too big to fall down. The bells are ringing tonight, across 1,000 worlds that I will never visit, among species that I will never meet, in languages that I will never speak. The bells are ringing because they can. Because 31 ugly ships looked at an empire and laughed, and the sound of that laughter carried further than any weapon ever could. I closed my log, turned off my console, leaned back in my chair, and listened to the bells.